Welcome to the Mind Money Spectrum podcast, where your hosts, Aaron Agti and Trishul Patel, go beyond traditional finance questions to help you explore how to use your money to achieve the freedom you want in life.
In this episode, Aaron and Trishul discuss saving for college. How much do parents need to save to fully fund 4 years at UCLA or a more expensive private school? What are the variables to consider? Will higher education costs keep rising faster than inflation? And what are the benefits of a 529 plan? The math isn't particularly complex, but trying to predict the choices of teenagers 18 years in advance requires strategic planning and flexibility. And now, on to our conversation.
Hi, my name is Aaron Agti. I'm a financial advisor in the Bay Area, and I'm here with Trishul Patel, a wealth manager on the East Coast.
Hey, Aaron, great to be here today.
Great to be here as well. Today, we're going to be talking about college planning, specifically for parents with young children who want to save for college. How to start thinking about it? How much do they need to save? What are some of the ideas that they need to be aware of? And what they can start doing now to make things a lot easier in the future. This is not necessarily a conversation about how does your high school student apply for college financial aid or fill out the FAFSA or for scholarships. This is really designed for families with young kids, like elementary school or younger, that have the foresight and want to start saving for that long-term future goal. So for context, my children are 9, 7, and 4. And I've been saving for college because I'm a financial advisor basically since the oldest one was born. So, Trishul, what is your situation like when it comes to children and planning for college?
Right. So, as we'll certainly discuss, the price of college continues to increase higher than inflation. So we realized this early on. So about 2 years before my daughter was born, we started saving away in a 529 program, which we'll, of course, talk about over the course of this episode. And my daughter's 2 now, so we've had her savings going for about 4 years. And of course, the plan is to have a nice cushion in place for when she's, 17, 18, something like that.
Okay, I was going to wait till much, much later, but now I have to bring this up. Who was the beneficiary on the 529 plan when you first opened it?
Oh, you're speaking with him. Me. So you're allowed to open a 529 and declare yourself the beneficiary initially, and then once you have a child that requires those payments, or even if you want to take some educational courses on your own, you can do that.
Yeah, so that would be one of the things we'll get to is that 529 plans have to have a beneficiary with a social security number. So can't open a 529 plan for an unborn child. You have to technically open it for someone else. But one of the big benefits is that you can change the beneficiary. So we'll get into that later, but that's more foresight than I think anyone I know. But knowing you, I guess that part doesn't surprise me. If anyone was going to save for college 2 years before the kid was born, it was probably Trishul Patel.
Well, but, sooner helps. So.
Okay, so again, my kids are 9, 7, and 4. Trishul has a 2-year-old, but has been saving for 4 years. I also went to UCLA. My wife went to UCLA, and we are very, very proud Bruins. So we are going to use UCLA as the example of the greatest school that you could ever go to. But when it comes to numbers, it'll be an in-state public school. And the numbers line up pretty well across most states and most kind of in-state public schools. And just because UCLA is obviously the number one public university in the country. And there's actually our verification. I think they have been selected by a U.S. News Report as the best public college in the country. So my school pride is going to come out a lot today.
I won't fight this. I don't think I'll push back on that.
So, but UCLA And most of the schools in the UC system, just because I'm in the Bay Area, and just if you happen to have numbers for any states on the East Coast, feel free to add them. But colleges will cost about $35,000 per year for an in-state resident. That's tuition, books, fees, room and board, and other. There will be a range depending on the level of the school and also the city they're in. So room and board can be more expensive in more expensive areas that have a higher cost of living, could be less expensive in more rural areas. So that is one thing that will change. But for the University of California system, it's usually on the scale of $32,000 to $38,000. So 35 is a really good number right in the middle. California also has the CSU system. It's a California State University. This would be schools like San Jose State University, San Diego State University, and that tends to be an average of about $27,000 per year. So it's known in California that this is a tier below the UC system, but it still provides a four-year university, four-year degree, bachelor's degree. They have dorms, and so they still have the room and board costs. And those tend to be on the range of $23,000 to $29,000 per year. And this is, again, in today's dollars. This is right now. And the last public option is usually on the scale of community college. And because there's no room and board aspect and you're paying for the classes as you take them, the costs tend to be on the scale of $3,000 to $4,000 per year. Community college is incredibly affordable compared to the four-year universities, especially once you take out room and board. That is probably on the scale of half the cost of some of these in-state public universities is just the room and board aspect. So if you were really looking to save money, you could even go to an in-state school, but they could stay at home. That really limits your options in terms of geography, but that is what one way is to save on college. So for public, those would be our reference points. UC schools and UCLA specifically, $35,000 per year. CSUs, about $27,000 per year. Community college, $3,000 or $4,000 per year. The other thing that comes up are private schools. So again, I'm in the Bay Area. The closest large, well-known private university is Stanford. There will be other private universities that I prefer not to talk about, located also in the LA area, but they're just not as good. But a lot of the private schools, so this would be most of the Ivy League schools on the East Coast. There's a lot of liberal arts colleges that'll be a similar cost. And it's actually about $71,000, $72,000 per year. The range is probably on the scale of $66,000 to $75,000. Now, that is the sticker price. And while some people pay that, there are a variety of options that private schools will offer that public schools don't. So private schools will always be more expensive than public schools, but it might not always be that twice as much number. So that's one thing to kind of take into consideration when looking at trying to plan really, really far out. Trishul, do you have any other numbers in front of you kind of when you think about what your savings target was in terms of the actual dollar amount, whether it's an in-state public school, private school, something like that?
Right. So in my situation, I went to Cornell University. They do have a public component, but I was on the engineering program there, and that's on the private school side. And if I recall, this was around 20 years ago. I believe it was around $30,000 a year. And your numbers are around right for what it is now, around 70,000, including room and board per year. So when we were saving for my daughter, we did some calculators. You can find these online for what to expect. So we kind of targeted 400,000 in about 20 years from when we started saving for a 4-year program at a private school in terms of what to expect.
That's probably a good ballpark, and I'll go into kind of how we get there. And like you said, there's online calculators. The math really isn't that hard. If you start with the age of the child, and this is basically like how many years until they turn 18. So it's how many years of savings you can and growth you can add in. So start with the age of the child. the current cost of college. So we said $72,000 for a private school, $35,000 for UCLA, and we're going to add inflation to that. Like you said, colleges have been increasing and inflating greater than normal inflation for the rest of the country. So if inflation assumption for most goods and prices is about 3%, most of the time I tend to use a 5% inflation. You add an investment return assumption. So if you're saving into a 529 plan and investing in that 529 plan, what is your rate of return assumption on the investments? And then the last one is a monthly or lump sum. I use these both, not because you're definitely going to use one or the other, but they really help illustrate the cost in today's dollars. So the result would be how much you need to save each month starting now through when the child finishes college. So when they go into their senior year of college and they're making that last tuition payment. Or how much would you need in a lump sum now? So if there was a large liquidity event and you wanted to take care of college now, set aside a certain amount of money to see it grow to fund college. And usually it's some combination of those two. They might have a little bit saved and they want to know, okay, I have this much towards my lump sum and how much do I need to add per month? But those are kind of the only variables that you need to figure out how much do you need to actually save for college to fully fund 4 years at a public or private school, whatever your desire is. So in this case, if we have a newborn and they want to go to UCLA, because every child wants to go to UCLA, it is the most applied to school in the country every year. And we do a 5% inflation, and we'll be a little conservative, so we get a 7% rate of return over the next 20 years. To fully fund 4 years at UCLA, you would need to save $689 per month or set aside a lump sum of $95,877. Again, you have to save almost $700 per month to fully fund 4 years at UCLA, at an in-state public school. And very roughly, private schools are on the scale of double that. If you're looking to fully fund 4 years at a private school and pay sticker price, you probably need to save on the scale of $1,300 to $1,400 per month for a newborn. Now, those are pretty big numbers. And my first question for you, Trishul, because you actually had that like -2 on the age, so you actually had 2 extra years of compounding. But what were the numbers that you used when you did the math, if you remember?
Right. So this can even probably be done on a napkin, but with a calculator, we had about 20 years. Mm-hmm. And the number it spit out was 400,000. And if something compounds at 7%, we've kind of talked about this, it doubles every 10 years.
Yep.
So if you kind of put away 100,000 after 10 years, you have 200, and after 20, you have 400. So that's kind of what we did.
And do you remember what the cost of Cornell that you had in mind?
What we did is we didn't specifically target Cornell. We just put in we selected private school in the, the calculator option. And a lot of the calculators online, we'll certainly put some links in the show notes, but they let you choose, private versus public and how much you have right now, pretty much the parameters that you mentioned and how long you have until the child attends school. So that's the numbers that it spit out to us. Okay,
so it said 100,000 was the future cost.
The current cost.
Do you remember what your rate of return was?
But I'm pretty sure it's around market, because if you take 100 and you double it over 10 years, that's 7% return.
Okay.
So that gets you to 200, and then you double it again over 10 years. So now you have 20 total years. The 200 goes to 400,000. Meaning, if you put a lump sum of 100,000 after 20 years, you would have that 400.
So I guess my first thought, I wonder if that private school number was a little lower.
It could have been. It might have not been the sticker price. It might have been the price after a reasonable amount of benefit that individuals get. For example, some calculators you can say, what do you expect your income to be around the time your child goes to school? And the reason that's important is that's what drives financial aid and other types of benefits that you might receive. And that might lower that sticker price to, a good percentage, in fact. Something you might have heard across the headlines is some schools currently, if you have an income below a certain amount, tuition is free. That, for example, I think Stanford has this and Harvard has this and many other schools have this.
Yeah, I want to ask you to actually do that present value calculation right now. I'll kind of double check my numbers because I'm getting a cost as a present value of about $25,000 or $26,000. You know what? No, hold on. I'm doing my math wrong. So I'm doing it the rate of return, not the inflation assumption. Do you remember what you chose as inflation assumption?
Let's see. So this is a calculator from savingsforcollege.com. They have a few calculators. It goes through a little bit of a survey where you answer a couple questions. Say, if you want public or private. And what we chose is for a child going to college in 2037 for a 4-year private school. And the sticker price at that age, according to this website, is $395,000.
For 4 years.
For 4 years, yeah.
Okay. So I guess I have that as assuming a 5% inflation, that would be $37,000 or $38,000 per year.
That could be. And the typical family that earns $100K would get about $160,000 in scholarships and grants and tuition assistance. So then the amount they might actually pay is around $233,000. Okay.
So again, just newborn going to UCLA, $35,000 per year, 5% inflation, 7% rate of return. You need to save $700 per month. If we change those numbers just slightly, so let's say we assume only a 4% college inflation, which is not a conservative assumption. It's actually probably more on the aggressive side. And we assume an 8% rate of return, which is also, again, a little more aggressive, but it helps understand the impact of math. We probably only need to save $512 per month, or a lump sum of $66,000. That could fully fund UCLA for a newborn. So we get 20 years of growth.
Right. And I should add, I'm looking at the footnotes for this particular calculator. They had a cost increase of only 3.3% a year with a 7% return. So that could probably make the difference that you're seeing.
Okay, so 3.3. So I actually want to do 3.3. Use 20 years. Okay, so I have a cost of $52,000 for a private school. That starts to feel
right. That sounds about right.
Okay, so again, this is why kind of you have to look at the assumptions when you're doing the math. 3.3 that's a little low. I don't know if that would be an acceptable number.
Well, it's interesting because you and I have talked about a notion like this before about how the cost of college, including the cost of healthcare and housing, continue to increase beyond CPI, beyond inflation, to the point where over our generation, these costs have gone up considerably, since we were born. A few of those numbers that might be relevant are, for example, with tuition over this period, from let's say 1990 until about now, that's 30 years, tuition prices have gone up 400%. And inflation itself, meaning, just what's going on with average things, has gone up about, you can call it something like food and beverage has gone up only like 100%, so it's doubled.
Yeah.
So you're talking about something that has gone up quite a bit, and if it continues that trend, you almost get silly numbers, which is kind of what we're also seeing. At the same time, just as a reference, we've talked about this before, housing over the last 30 years has gone up 312%. So one thing I had mentioned, and we discussed this in one of our future looking episodes, is that I really don't see a reason why tuition has to increase at this rate. What we're really trying to do is just communicate information to people. Why does it cost $100,000 a year to do that? So I'm hoping there'll be secular changes in the market by the time, 10, 20 years from now that really drive these prices down. One thing that we did mention is the classes for these top schools like Stanford and MIT, they're online for free. So I feel like things like this will put a lot of pressure down the road on reducing prices. So I'm hopeful they will, because in my mind, 4, 5, 6% increases in price are not sustainable.
I can see that. And so current CPI is like 2.3, 2.4%. So even that 3.3 number is still greater than CPI, which that kind of makes sense. I could also see the cost of private schools not going up as much. I think there's definitely supply and demand dynamics. I know every time we actually go back and visit UCLA campus, probably about once a year. We stop there on our drive to Disneyland in the summer, and
Which one has more attractions these days?
Well, they're both closed. They're both shut down.
Right.
But basically, since we've graduated, they have never stopped building. They've never stopped construction. There's always a new major project. They've added a couple huge dorms, and this might be related to population demographics of California. It could be other parts of kind of education, but there's no slowdown in the demand side. And they literally are capped on space. They can only fit so many students into the classes and the dorms. So I think that's a big reason why we're seeing those inflation numbers. So I do wonder if public school inflation will be greater than private school inflation over the next couple decades, where there's no reason for it to cost $100,000, but if UCLA keeps getting 100,000, 110,000 applicants and more people want to go than they can fit, then yeah, they might see those numbers inflate.
Right, because I think also what's going on is the notion that a lot of these top schools, that they want to compete with each other. If one school gets a new, stadium that's better than a professional team, well, now all the other schools need to catch up too. And it's kind of like a nuclear arms race where everybody tries to outbid the other. But then, as you mentioned, there's clearly the demand. And one line of thinking is that demand is there for a couple of reasons. Something that we've seen with the housing prices inflation over the past 30 or 40 years is that access to liquidity so that people can upsize their houses and buy second houses and buy more houses because they can borrow money so easily. Well, there's the notion that so can a 17-year-old. They can borrow $100,000 even if they've never worked a day in their lives. And part of that means now they have more money to spend on schools. Now, what does that mean for the schools? Well, now they can charge more because the kids have more. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle there that may actually be driving these prices up beyond what might make sense in a similar situation. The other thing I'd like to comment on is, for example, you may have heard a statistic like this or similar to this, where a generation ago, you could afford a 4-year public education with just working 300 hours at a minimum wage job. And if you want that same 4-year public education today, you have to work over 4,400 hours.
Remember, how many hours are in a year?
Some quick math is if you divide 4,459, that's the number that I saw, by 52 weeks out of a year, that's 85.
Okay. So, yeah, there's literally 8,760 hours in a year.
Yeah.
So you're taking approximately 12 hours per day to working 12 hours a day to pay for college.
Right.
And you have to sleep and fit, the actual going to college somewhere in there.
Right. And that's today. So imagine that same increase. That's over 10x increase for the last 30 years. Imagine that 10x increase over the next 30. These numbers just get absurd. It kind of comes to the point where it scratches my mind. Why save up $1 million for a kid to go to undergrad and graduate school when you could just give them $1 million? They could probably live off that for the rest of their life. Here's $1 million for your education. Now go earn it all back after you graduate. I feel like the numbers just get silly from that perspective.
Okay. I actually like that thought exercise, and it does tie into a few of the things I have coming later. So I want to get back to the actual mechanics of saving for college. So as everyone's probably heard, a 529 plan is by far the most effective vehicle for saving specifically for a child's college education. The money you put in is after tax, so there's no tax benefit on the deductions, mostly depending on your state. There's actually some states that do allow tax deductions on the contributions to 529 plans, as long as you choose the plan sponsored by that particular state. So check with your particular state. California is one of the states that does not. So there's no tax benefit on the contributions. The growth in a 529 plan for everyone is tax-free when used for higher education. And there is some kind of leeway and some flexibility in the definition of higher education. It has to be an accredited university or accredited higher education program. Could be a trade school, like you mentioned. There's other certifications that you can take. It could also be things like the laptop, the room and board associated with going to college. So they do give you some flexibility that as long as it's an accredited program, there are going to be ancillary costs. So the growth is tax-free when used for education. If it's not used for education, there is a 10% penalty and you owe taxes on the growth. If it's offset by scholarships, so if you save enough and they end up getting scholarships, they don't need the 529 plans, there's no penalty, but you are taxed on the growth. So if you have money that you know is going to go to a college education, a 529 plan is by far the best vehicle. The funding is also higher than most other tax-preferred vehicles. You can actually pre-fund 5 years worth of gifts to a 529 plan. So in 2020, that's $15,000 per year. Does that sound right off the top of your head?
Yeah.
Yeah. So 2020, you can gift $15,000 per year without it counting against your lifetime exemption. You can actually pre-fund 5 years. So you can do $75,000 into a 529 plan, and it follows gift tax rules. So it's per person, two person. So a father could contribute $75,000 to a 529 plan. A mother could contribute $75,000 to a 529 plan. A grandparent could also contribute $75,000 to a 529 plan. So in terms of the contributions, the numbers are so high that it's so unlikely that there's going to be any kind of prohibitive factor there. If you're running up against the contribution limits, you have other plans for this 529 plan, and you'll be talking to your tax attorney and doing something different. You don't need to be listening to us. But if for college, 529 plan is still the best vehicle. The other big benefits are that the parent, usually the account owner, the account holder maintains ownership. So the parent stays in control of this money. This money is never owned or held by the child. And there's some other vehicles that people might use, but they'll have to give the money over at 18 or 21 or 25, depending on their setup. In the case of a 529 plan, the parent is always the owner, always maintains control. As we talked about before, the parent can change the beneficiaries. So if you have multiple children, you can change the beneficiary from the older child to the younger child. again, tax-free growth. Check with your state to see if they allow the tax deduction. Pre-funding 5 years, follows after gift tax rules. The other benefit I like about 529 plans is the age-based asset allocation. And this is similar to target date funds for retirement, but pretty much every 529 plan now offers some kind of age-based asset allocation where when they're really young, it starts off very aggressive. But as you get closer to that college enrollment time, it gradually gets more conservative and follows a glide path of getting a little bit more conservative as you get closer, so that when your high school junior is looking at college a year and a half away and the market goes down by 20 or 30%, their college savings isn't going to be impacted the same. It's going to be mostly bonds as you get that close. That's another thing I like about it. It's a really convenient way to make sure that you're always staying on track and that the investments always stay in line with the particular goal that you have in mind. So that's another reason why I think 529 plans are the best vehicle when saving for college. Do you have any other kind of quick thoughts or additions when it comes to 529 plans specifically?
I think the other thing is, as you mentioned, to tag along the point about the beneficiaries, you can be the beneficiary as well. Meaning, if you have some extra money in your 60s, you can use that to go back and get a master's or PhD in pottery. So it's certainly something that has a good amount of flexibility, which is why it is a popular choice.
I would probably say that more likely if you're in your 60s, you can change the beneficiary to a grandchild.
That's true too.
Yeah. That's probably just a little more common than people getting their PhD in pottery.
Perhaps, but one can dream.
So the other big thing I like to point out with clients is when saving for college, you should not sacrifice your retirement savings for college savings. Retirement savings for yourself will always be more important. This is because there are other things that exist that can help fund college that do not exist for your own financial independence. Things like student loans, scholarships that can fund private school, scholarships that can fund school costs. You can go to a public school versus a private school. So you can also get more financial aid to go to private school. And with the addition of community college, you have more control of the costs of that future college education. So in Trishul's example, what happens when his daughter doesn't want to go to a private school and wants to go to a public school? And all of that extra money that Trishul has in his 529 plan. That's something that is a real possibility. It's at 2 years old, or even at -2, there's no way to predict how that individual child will look like going through school and what their future desires might be. And with college savings, you have control of the costs in a way that you don't really with financial independence and retirement. And the last, you have to acknowledge the possibility that your child may not go to college. That is a possibility. So be careful about saving too much for college at the expense of your own retirement. And this is where we come to the difference of, there's a difference between how much you are saving for college and how much you're saving in a 529 plan specifically. So this is where the idea that it might be okay to save for college in a taxable investment account. Just buy a portfolio of stocks and bonds that are designed for long term. And if your child goes to college, then you have that money there. But if they don't, or they don't need as much, it's okay to, it's much more easy, it's much easier and much more flexible to have that money set aside that you can use for other goals as well. You don't pay the additional taxes or penalties by taking money out of a 529 plan that's not used for college. So that's the big thing I emphasize with clients. Don't sacrifice your retirement savings for college savings. The other thing I always point out to parents is talk about your parenting values. With your spouse, think about what values you want to instill in them when it comes to that huge financial decision down the road. Do you want to fund 4 years at a public university? Or do you want your kids to have some skin in the game? Do you want them to have to start making that cost benefit analysis in high school and make that part of the decision-making process? Do you want to fund 4 years at a private school? And do you want to kind of take off all the costs and concerns and worries so they can focus on schoolwork? And this is actually a story that I tell. My wife and I have gone through this specific example. I knew before high school and definitely in high school that my parents were not going to pay for college. They made it very, very clear they would not have the extra income or savings to pay for college. So I knew I had to work hard in high school, and I actually got enough scholarships to cover my 4 years at UCLA. I applied for about a scholarship per week starting my junior year into my senior year. So I knew that I was not going to get any money from my parents. My wife knew that her parents were paying for college, and she got into UCLA engineering. I went to UCLA for applied math. And when we were going through college, I got a student job as a football referee for intramural sports. I used that for kind of going out money and having fun. My wife, because her parents were paying for everything, they didn't want her to have a job. They wanted her to have the time to focus on her schoolwork. And being an engineer, it was much harder and probably more work to do than I had. So she was not allowed to have a job. And this is just two examples of what values as a parent do you want to instill on your kids. So Trishul, when I asked that question to you, what are some of the conversations you've had with your wife about the values you want to instill and how the college cost conversation participates in that, how it contributes to that conversation?
We weighed our options similar to how you and your wife likely did. And we also ran through some of these calculators and numbers that we've put forward and that we've discussed on this chat today. And it came down to a couple of things. We realized, for example, the main options in the US are that 529. And there's also something known as a prepaid plan. That was something big in Florida where we were at the time. And the notion with the prepaid plan is that you can set up a plan where you can lock in the current price of tuition today and pay that price for when your child goes to school, whether it's 5, 10, 15, or 18 years. Basically, the child has to be born. And what that means is, okay, now you know what the price is. You don't have to worry about how much it might grow, whether it's at 3.5, 4, or 5%, because you basically get today's price. And they set up plans so that you can pay off today's price sooner rather than later. So that's another option that we were thinking about. Now, the concern with the prepaid plan that we found was basically it's run by the state. So at that point, what that would mean is we would be saving for our child to go to a state school in Florida. And for many people, that does make a lot of sense, but we realize that we do like flexibility and we end up moving around a lot. So that ended up being a bit of a concern. Now, prepaid plans can have the flexibility to move, but there's all these caveats. So it's something you have to think about when you're digging into these types of plans. And it does vary state by state. So you have to think about that as well. So those were the two options on the table. And then also the notion that my wife grew up internationally, we looked across the world to see our options there. And we understand that there's lots of good universities, not only in this country, but in other places. And many of those other places also have various forms of subsidies to consider. So I think all of that crossed our mind. And what we ended up ultimately doing is we decided to just initially fund enough to cover a good amount of an undergrad. And then we just kind of decided there's so many other variables, whether we might even be in the US or that our daughter would want to go to school in the US, or sorry, our unborn child would want to go to school in the US. So that also was on her mind as well.
But what did you talk about the idea of, do you want to fund all 4 years for them and
Right,
remove
so
any cost concern from the table?
for example, the way it was with my family is, and I guess this started with my grandfather on my dad's side, where he was a big believer in education, and the notion that he passed down to his 8 kids is that all kids should go to school for as much and as long as they want and get the most amount of education that they needed. And this was something that he believed in because he grew up in poverty, and he kind of climbed himself out, and he realized the importance of that. So he tried to pass that down to his children. And as a result, they did end up becoming quite successful. And that's trickled down to that generation, which is my generation. So what that meant is basically for myself and my siblings and my cousins, we've had the opportunity to go to any school that we wanted and for as long as we wanted, including whether it be masters or professional schools such as medical schools or whatever it happened to be. And it's kind of like that paying forward notion where if you pay it forward one generation, the math becomes a lot easier than the reverse. So that's something that I think made sense in terms of what led me to where I am. And in the conversations with my wife, I put that forward as an option for my daughter. And I feel like that does make sense. Now, the only part that doesn't make sense is the change in prices. And they somehow get absurd if we use the metrics and the calculators that are out there today. I think we plugged in some math. For example, if we change that 3.3% assumption to require 400,000, if we use like 5% over the next 20 years or so, that means we need about 535,000 for undergrad. And we just ballparked it at $1 million if you want to throw in grad school or professional school. And, just thinking through that, we just realized that's something we're up to the challenge, but it just doesn't make a lot of sense, meaning we think something's going to give. We think that there must be some sort of changes that need to happen, because having somebody need a $1 million education plus just out of high school, it just doesn't quite sit right.
And that's part of the areas that I try to encourage my clients to talk between themselves and think about this. It's if there's that cost for college, what is the value of college? And this is a entirely other conversation, but it's things like, does that bachelor's degree act as a either verification or it gets past the gatekeepers in job applications? It's like a minimum requirement for everyone for a particular job. Is it just the bachelor's degree itself? Is that the necessary item? Is it the networking and just developing the friends and community from other people who are also going to college? So they also value education, and they value that kind of hard work and going through classes and having that schedule. Is it the knowledge itself? Like you said, all the education, all the classes are online, and a lot of them are free for free. Is the knowledge itself the primary emphasis of going to college? One of the theories I liked personally was undergrad taught me how to learn. And what that meant was, after I got out of college, whenever I took on something new, so my Series 7, my insurance license, my CFP, like this continuing education, I know how I learn and how I can absorb and retain material. And that going through that process of college, it didn't exist after high school. Just high school is too regimented, too much was taken on by the teachers telling students what to do because they have to do that for everyone. Whereas college allowed me to develop that independent learning mindset. So these are just some of the things that I encourage parents to talk about when they are thinking about saving for that cost of college, or that what's the value of college and what parenting values they want to instill. As we wrap up, the last couple of things I like to point out, there's kind of different strategies that may or may not work. Because you can change the beneficiaries of 529 plans, for parents with multiple children, it can make more sense to fund the older child's 529 plan a little more aggressively. It's probably okay to have too much in the older child's 529 plan, knowing that you can change the beneficiary to a younger child, to a younger sibling. That again gets back to parenting values. Are you okay with that idea of unequal contributions to 529 plans for multiple children? Can you manage that yourself and or with the children, knowing how you're going to make those movements? Or do you want to keep the same amount for each child? But overfunding the oldest, because you can change beneficiaries, flexibility on the back end. Another strategy I've talked about with clients, it's related to our buying stocks for fun and investing in stocks. A lot of my clients work at companies where they have stock plans, and I make it very clear that you do not want to risk your retirement by putting all of your money in one stock. You don't want to be too concentrated. That owning a single stock, whether it's your employer stock or just any stock you buy, is high risk, high reward, and does not make sense to risk your retirement and financial independence by betting on one stock. But because college is technically optional, and there are those other ways to pay for college, the student loans, scholarships, or just choosing a less expensive college, it might be okay to use company stock to save for college, where now you've maintained that natural desire to invest in your employer, and the risk that you are taking on there is in line with something that is technically optional, that you have that flexibility. And the last thing that I point out to clients, whenever I do retirement projections or financial plans for clients that include college, your income likely grows over time, and your peak earning years are likely in your 50s and 60s. So if you can manage your expenses and kind of fight lifestyle creep, it actually might be possible to pay for college out of pocket. This is something that happens more than people realize, and it's really hard to understand in your 20s and 30s when you're trying to save for college 20 years later, that your income will go up, and as long as your expenses don't go up, and this is right in your ballpark, Trishul, it makes it easier to just pay for that excess college out of pocket. There's a pretty good chance that if your income goes up and you don't let your expenses go up, you can afford that difference if you weren't saving enough for college. So is there anything you want to add, or kind of as I wrapped up with those kind of 3 or 4 strategies that I offer to clients when it comes to college savings?
I think those are all very good points. It makes a lot of sense. One thing I quickly typed into or jotted down on my napkin in front of me is that if somebody is planning on spending $1 million on their higher education, we all know that 4% rule of that's $40,000 that somebody might be able to live off of for the next 30 years. So maybe that's a type of benefit that somebody might be able to leverage beyond a college education. So just something to think about.
That's a good point. And I would say the saving for grad school is very ambitious. I do see some clients that prioritize that, but most seem to have a mentality of they'll pay for undergrad and grad school's on your own. Also because once you go to grad school, the incomes tend to be high enough to pay off enough of those student loans that 20-year-olds take out to fund grad school. But that's, again, it's getting back to that parenting values conversation.
Yeah, there's a lot of choices to think about. And I think you were spot on with the notion that it definitely involves a thoughtful set of conversations as you're planning out this in terms of what do you think would make the most sense for your specific situation, even though you're trying to extrapolate maybe 10, 20 years into the future.
Yeah, that's a great point. Just try and predict what your newborn child is going to do in their teenage years is so difficult that maintaining flexibility is probably one of the big keys. Saving more and keeping your expenses lower are one of the ways to maintain flexibility. Saving some in a 529 plan, some not, maintains flexibility. I think that's a good overarching theme. I like that.
Great. Well, thanks, Aaron. I appreciate your time today, and I really enjoyed this conversation. And thanks, everybody, for listening.
Thank you as well. I did like this, and if you have any questions, feel free to send them our way. We can point you in the direction of a financial calculator that will do the math for you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Aaron.
Okay, thanks, Trishul. Bye.
Okay, bye.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of the Mind Money Spectrum podcast. Be sure to visit mindmoneyspectrum.com to access the entire library of episodes. Remember, it's not black and white, but the wide spectrum of gray area where you get to pursue the freedoms you want in life. Opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical as no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested in directly. Have a nice day.